Last week, Japan announced they'd be dumping treated radioactive water from the Fukushima power plant into the ocean. As we discussed on the show, neighboring countries, including Korea and China, have openly denounced this decision, while the U.S. sided with Japan, reiterating it was according to international standards. It's still divisive, and a lot of questions remain about, the state of the Fukushima water and why this had to be a decision that Japan seemingly had to make. For JAMA's Focus today, we have the host of weekly NK News podcast and public relations consultant at Insight Communications, Jacko Zwetsloot, joining us on the line. Good morning, Jacko.
Good morning, Lena.
Happy Monday.
Happy Monday to you.
All right, so let's talk about Fukushima water. First and foremost, for some of our listeners that may not have caught up with all of our headlines, why are we talking about the Fukushima reactor more than 10 years after Japan's biggest recorded earthquake and the tsunami?
That's a good question. The earthquake measuring 9.1 on the Richter scale happened on March 11th, 2011, with many aftershocks and also a massive tsunami. And this tsunami caused meltdowns, hydrogen explosions, and multiple releases of radioactive contamination in units 1, 2, and 3 of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. In terms of nuclear accidents, it was not as bad as Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1984, but worse than the 3 Mile Island plant accident in Pennsylvania in 1979. Now, 10 years and a month later, we're still talking about this accident because, as you said in the intro, the Japanese government plans to release a large quantity of water that is contaminated with radioactive isotopes called tritium into the Pacific Ocean.
And for some of our listeners tilting their heads, we keep dropping the word tritium as if we should all be aware what it means. We'll try to clarify in just a moment. Okay, so tritium, it's a word that has been flagged as a carcinogen, but do we really understand what it is?
Yeah, it's something I had to learn too.
Yeah.
We didn't learn about this in my high school chemistry class, but it's a radioactive form of hydrogen. The nucleus of a hydrogen atom normally has 1 proton, but the nucleus of an atom of tritium has 1 proton and also 2 neutrons. Tritium is a byproduct of the nuclear reactor, and it's often used in medical testing as a tracer to follow the path of a fluid through the body, for example, when they're taking a scan, and also to make glow-in-the-dark watch faces.
Those are 2 very different usages, but you're right. So it is used, and it is I suppose, safe enough to use in the human body, right?
That's right. At low concentrations and low amounts, it's not specifically carcinogenic or dangerous or toxic to the body.
All right. This actually isn't the first release of contaminated water from the Fukushima power plant. So what was the initial outcome of that meltdown?
Right. First, I need to explain a little bit about coolant. So inside every nuclear reactor, there are fuel rods that are used to create fission reactions, which generate the nuclear power. And these fuel rods get very, very hot. And so it's important to keep them cool all the time. Most of the time, that is done with water, which must be constantly pumped around the fuel rods. Now, it's my understanding that under normal circumstances, when all's going well, the reactor's coolant water doesn't become seriously contaminated by radioactive material. And when it does, it's usually with material with a short half-life. That is, it reduces in radioactivity by half in a short period of time. Also, there's groundwater that flows in and out of the plant, and that becomes contaminated too, to an extent. So what they do is they capture contaminated coolant water and groundwater, and they treat it through a processing system stored in tanks at the site. That's what happens normally at any power plant. But what happened here in 2011 after the Fukushima earthquake, a combination of automatic reactor shutdowns, loss of power, and flooding of the reactors by seawater from that massive tsunami meant those normal cooling processes stopped and everything was broken. And because of that uncontrolled flow of seawater in and out of the power plant, a lot of radioactive material, specifically cesium-137, flowed into the Pacific Ocean as a direct result of the accident. So some of the outflows that we've already seen were accidental or uncontrolled, and some were deliberate discharges by TEPCO.
All right. So by some standards, small dosages of tritium wouldn't be fatal, as you've said, but standards have been adjusted in the past, and so it does, I think, sound an alarm for many of us who may not know enough about it. So is tritium dangerous?
Yeah, it's a controversial question. Tritium is weakly radioactive. Now, not all radioactive things are equally powerful. The particles that tritium throws off when decaying are too weak to pass through human skin, and affect the body, unlike, say, uranium or plutonium, which are what the nuclear fuel rods are made from. But if you breathe tritium in or drink water that contains tritium, it can build up in your body and it can cause cancer at high levels, they say, like many things can. But here's the point of contention. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission says that you would need to ingest billions of units of becquerels before you see any health effects. Now, you might wonder, what are becquerels? Well, that's how we measure radioactivity. Now, one of the tanks at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the one with the highest concentration of tritium, has 2.5 million becquerels per liter. A single kilogram of uranium, which is the element often used in nuclear reactors as a fuel, has 25 million becquerels. So to drink enough water from the most contaminated plant in Fukushima to ingest 1 billion becquerels and see possible negative health effects, you would need to drink 400 liters of that water. And we also have to remember that tritium has a half-life of only 12.3 years. That means every 12.3 years, the number of radioactive tritium atoms is reduced by half. Since we're just over 10 years since the earthquake and the accident, that means we have a little over half of the original amount of tritium left, and that keeps halving every 12.3 years. And when tritium decays, it becomes helium-3, which is not radioactive and not toxic.
I mean, that's the science, but I guess public sentiment is something completely different we also have to address, right? Let's talk about other radioactive materials that were in the water. Have they also been removed?
In 2014, TEPCO spent a lot of money to buy new technology from a US-based company to remove radioactive strontium from the water. This is an element that we often hear about when we talk about nuclear leaks, because strontium is the element that poses the biggest ecological risk, according to the Wall Street Journal. Cesium-137, is also in that water in higher quantities than strontium, but it's less dangerous, and that's already been removed, apparently. The reason strontium is so dangerous to living things is because chemically it's similar to calcium, so it tends to deposit itself in bones, and that can lead to bone cancer and leukemia and so on. So the teams at TEPCO have been using an advanced liquid processing system, or ALPS, to deal with 62 of the 63 radioactive materials in tank water to prepare it for release into the environment. Now, I have to point out that in 2018, TEPCO came clean and admitted that it hadn't actually filtered out all the dangerous materials out of the water over the years since the accident. Hopefully, it's doing a much better job now, and it certainly should, because there's a lot of scrutiny leading up to the forthcoming release of the tritium water.
So why can't the tritium be removed from the water completely, right? I mean, if they had it in the storage facilities for years on end, could they not have figured out a way to treat it within the system?
That's because tritium isn't in the water. Tritium is actually part of the water.
Okay.
Since tritium is a type of hydrogen, and water, as we all know from school, is 2 atoms of hydrogen combined with 1 atom of oxygen, tritium water is simply a kind of radioactive water, in which those hydrogen atoms are actually tritium atoms. So a few years ago, the Japanese government issued a report in which it said, in theory, tritium could be separated, but there's no practical separation technology on an industrial scale. Accordingly, a controlled environmental release is said to be the best way to treat low tritium concentration water.
Okay, so how much water is Japan going to dump into the ocean? Because that also, I think, brings into question, would it be diluted enough?
Yes. Now, we have to be careful with the word dump there, because it's almost like
we're going to do it all at once.
Pushing the button on the toilet and it all goes down at once, whereas this is a slow, steady discharge for many, many years. But yeah, TEPCO wants to discharge more than 1 billion liters of water that contains or that's made up of the radioactive tritium, and that's enough to fill 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. But as I said, it's not all going out at once.
They would discharge it slowly for a number of years, from what I understand, right? I
think maybe even decades, yes.
Okay, so what happens to radioactive material that goes into the ocean then, even at a slow rate?
It's important to remember that that water doesn't stay in one place. Almost immediately, it starts to become dispersed by ocean currents. And the coast of the Pacific coast near Fukushima has a very strong current called the Kuroshio current that moves contaminated water, and in fact all water, into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that has the effect of both transporting the radioactive material away from the source and diluting and dispersing it. And migratory fish in the ocean at a deeper level also move radioactive water around. So the importance of diluting it is to make it less dangerous. Governments and International Atomic Energy Agency, the one in Vienna, they have safety levels that show the maximum safe dosage in measurements of becquerels per kilogram. And the more you dilute the water, the more likely it is to fall below those safety limits.
So how do other power plants treat their radioactive water? Could Japan take notes from that?
According to a policy analyst at the World Nuclear Association, small amounts of tritium and other radioactive materials are discharged deliberately into rivers and oceans. And these are called authorized releases, and they're done in accordance with government oversight and are fully disclosed. So they also release water that contains radioactive isotopes, like TEPCO is going to do, but they do it in smaller quantities.
Even though it will be according to international standards, I mean, there was still criticism amongst, let's say, environmental groups. For example, even Greenpeace Japan. The growing criticism was that the Japanese government was opting for an economically sound decision at the cost of the environment. And it's because it brings up the possibility of maybe building more storage tanks to hold those water.
Yeah, that's a problem because basically the capacity there on the land that TEPCO owns is already full. They've already cut down trees, a whole lot of trees, to make room for an extra 1,000 tanks on top of the amount they already had. So if you look at the Daiichi power plant from above, you'll just see tanks on tanks on tanks that's storing that water. And the water stored in the tanks is already increasing by 400 tons a day because some of that groundwater that flows in and becomes contaminated is then captured and stored. So that amount is not stopping, it's increasing. And storage costs are almost $1 billion, with a B, dollars a year. And let's not forget that water, has a tendency of being corrosive over long periods of time, and tanks don't last forever. So eventually you'll see water leaking out of tanks and into the groundwater again, and tanks have to be replaced as well as added to. So there's an argument that the Japanese government or TEPCO could invest in gigantic reserve tanks of the kind that are usually used to store petroleum. The largest size would hold 2.4 billion litres. This would be enough to hold all the tritium-contaminated water that TEPCO wants to release at this stage. But that would be an expensive decision to make. And again, tanks are not a forever solution.
All right, so let's go back to Japan's plan to release the water in small amounts at a time. But when will the water be discharged according to Japan's plan?
According to a report this month from the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the release will start in about 2 years' time. So that'll be 12 years from the earthquake, and it will continue for decades. So, as I said, it won't be released all at once. Until that time, the water will continue to be diluted and filtered. I don't know yet exactly how or where the water will be discharged. That's something that Japan's nuclear regulator will have to approve. The International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna suggests that the best way might be to pump the water far into the middle of the Pacific Ocean at a very low depth, rather than at the coast or near the coast where fish and other forms of life breed. Now, the interesting thing is that because tritium is already used, as I said, as a tracer in human medical testing, scientists who study ocean currents, for example, for things like climate change, they'll be able to take advantage of that feature to see how tritium moves after the release. Scientists already have a good knowledge about how things move on the surface of oceans, for example, by studying those yellow plastic or rubber ducks that were famously fell off the side of a ship years ago. But they have less of an understanding of how things move at deeper levels in the ocean.
So kind of like when that is put into our human body and goes to the bloodstream, we could see the same with the currents, you mean, right? And that'll be kind of an uncalculated byproduct of discharging partially radioactive water.
Right.
All right. So what are they doing about the groundwater leaking in as of now?
TEPCO has built an underground ice wall and a drainage system to reduce the amount of groundwater that gets into the wrecked reactors by more than 50%. So some of it still gets in, and that water is then captured and put in those tanks.
We know that the Korean government is opposed to Japan's discharge of radioactive water, so is China. And it seems like the South Korean public sentiment around this topic is pretty emotional, it seems. And also the fact that they don't believe that it's safe.
As you had earlier on the show, South Korea expressed grave concern regarding the safety of its people and the environment. South Korea may take some sort of legal action to try to stop it. Greenpeace says the Japanese government should build more tanks to hold the water outside the plant. instead of the cheaper option of ocean release. But as I said, tanks aren't a forever solution. Fishing groups in and around Fukushima are opposed because they say that their catches will be contaminated and nobody in Japan or other countries will want to purchase their catches. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has actually dared Japanese officials to go and drink the tritium water or cook with it if it is so safe. Now, interestingly, Taro Aso, the current trade minister, did say that the water seemed safe enough to drink. That didn't mean he was going to actually drink it. And way back in 2011, just a year after the earthquake, a member of Japan's ruling party did actually drink a glass of water that had been contaminated inside the reactor building to show that the water was being decontaminated. And 3 independent human rights experts from the United Nations have expressed deep regret about the plan to discharge the water.
And there was also an announcement, I think, that surprised South Korea initially because, they're also considered our ally. Who is in favor of Japan's decision to release the contaminated water from Fukushima is also a point we have to discuss.
Yeah, the U.S. government said that this release is in line with global standards for discharging water from nuclear reactors. As I said earlier, discharging water from nuclear reactors is something that goes on all the time, just not with such publicity or with such large amounts of water. With plans for decades. But it should be noted that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does still maintain some import restrictions on food products from Fukushima because of that danger of radioactive contamination. Maybe not from that water, but from the soil around it. The International Atomic Energy Agency also supports the planned releases, saying that the method is both technically feasible and in line with international practice. And an American nuclear engineering professor who was interviewed on CNBC said he thinks the most realistic option is this, releasing the water, and this is the one that will have the least effect on the environment. He also thinks that other things dumped in the ocean, like plastics, are a greater danger to human health and well-being.
All right. Thank you so much for the thorough report. As always, Jacko, have a safe day, and I'll speak to you again next Monday.
Thank you, Lena.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.